Welcome everyone to GlobeSec's 2019 panel, Do It Yourself Intelligence. And thank you for all being here. There are some competing panels with presidents, so we're glad you're here. We were just discussing beforehand that we're going to get the real Intel nerds, we hope, in this room. Today we have with us, starting from this side, Hans Jakob Schindler. He is the senior director of the Counter-Extremism Project in New York, and he was previously head of the UN investigations team into ISIS or ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. And prior to that, he worked for Ambassador Freitag, who currently is the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO. And before that had a history of, as the Vice President, or that's the Deputy of the German Intelligence Service. And then we have Leah Gabriel. She's currently the Special Envoy and Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. And I'm really looking forward to hearing, these are your first public remarks since taking the job. She's also a former Navy Lieutenant Commander, fighter pilot, and human intelligence officer, CIA trained. So we've got three folks steeped in the intelligence world here. And then, as Mark says, then we have Mark. Mark Galeotti is a senior associate fellow at RUSI in London, but he is also former British Foreign Office with a focus on watching Moscow, among other things. So we thought we'd start with a definition of what is open source intelligence. And for those who aren't steeped in this field, you may hear the folks on stage occasionally use the word OSINT, which is an abbreviation for open source intelligence. And back in 2010, I looked up the CIA.gov definition. So OSINT is drawn from publicly available material, including the internet, traditional mass media, specialized journals, conference proceedings, and think tank studies, photos, and geospatial information, like commercial imagery products. That's changed a little bit, hasn't it? Who'd like to kick off? Ambassador Freitag.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah, certainly it's changing. Social media, I would add, as a massive field, and the internet is ever expanding. From my point of view, OSINT really means using publicly available information, any kind, also satellite information, by intelligence officers. That's what makes it INT.
Got it. Anyone else? Mark.
Well, as probably the person here who's been longest since they had any kind of classification. I'm tempted to say that OSINT is anything that I, as an academic, can get at, because I have absolutely get at without having to sign a piece of paper or similar. The problem is, though, that we find ourselves increasingly in a situation in which the edges of that get blurry. If I know an intelligence officer and over drinks this person sort of gives me a few snippets, am I a freelance human intelligence case officer? If Bellingcat, for example, this wonderful citizen intelligence and information sort of resource, are working off records that should not be in the public domain but are in the deep web,
i.e. WikiLeaks.
Or that, I mean, no, not even that. I mean, if one looks at their investigations of, for example, GRU, Russian military intelligence people, they're actually going after sort of car registration data, which shouldn't have been available, but is. I think the problem is we are now in the information age, which actually information is being generated and distributed far, far more quickly than we can control, let alone define it. And I think this is why it becomes a very sort of difficult topic to really nail down specifically.
Hans.
Yeah, and I think it also is changing a little bit. It gets more complex. When I was doing this, OSINT was a fancy word for reading, right? But also
like reading the newspapers.
Reading anything that comes on paper, and pictures or videos that were, although open source, you could get to them, were considered to be very, very weighty evidence for things. You could see that there was there. Nowadays, and this is one of the aspects that my organization now works on, that's no longer true. You cannot necessarily trust a picture, and with the deepfake phenomenon gaining ever more traction, you have doubts about videos now. So I think while you have more information, now you actually have to grapple with a sophisticated way in which disinformation is put out that goes beyond a capability of a human being to say, well, that sounds about good. You actually need, and sometimes technical means to tell that it's disinformation because it looks very real. I just remind everyone there was a very interesting video of Nancy Pelosi seemingly being drunk, and that was totally fabricated. I mean, that was actually electronically produced to make her look drunk. So, and this is just the beginning of what we are going to see as far as deepfake is concerned, as far as we can see in my organization.
Leah, to my understanding, you are the only one on stage who's actually CIA trained. So how has the definition changed since you got that training and did the job?
Well, I'd first say that, we used to have a joke that rumor intelligence, rumint, was an int as well. So I think of OSINT as anything that's open source that informs decision making in terms of intelligence. I put an int by it if it informs your decision making. So it's really how you use it. But since I was a case officer and since I went through that training, the communications age has just exploded. I mean, the way social media has developed, the way the internet and the way communications has developed, it's completely changed the way we do work. But I think ultimately anything that can inform your decision making should be used in terms of policy making, decision making, and OSINT plays a very large role in that now.
So one of the issues that I would often hear from when I would interview the head of the CIA's open source center, and of course it's changed names a few times, is that they couldn't get the resources for they couldn't get the people they wanted, they couldn't get the resources for the data crunching they wanted to do, and they felt like the stepchild of the Intel community, or at least their part of the Intel community. Is that changing?
Well, I think it definitely is changing, and I think it should change. You referred to us as Intel nerds, and I think that within the intelligence community there are sort of different levels of how people consider themselves or how they consider the intelligence that they have. Human officers tend to think that they're the coolest, but I think that as we see the communications age develop and we see this sort of up and coming generation of people who grew up on the internet and know how to use it very well and know how to use all these different tools out there, I think it will become much more sexy, I guess, as you could say, in the intelligence world. And I think you'll see more resources put towards it as people come to value the different sources of information that can be gathered openly.
Arndt, how about at NATO?
Yeah.
How much of a role does it play?
It also plays a role at NATO, but generally I fully concur with what you just said. I think it's a real culture change that's happening in the intelligence community. Many Intel officers that I have spoken to have been originally skeptical about it. It doesn't have the same kind of value or professionality, not as cool as humans and so on. And that appreciation is definitely changing.
It doesn't have classified stamped on the top of it, so it can't be as important.
Absolutely. But of course, I mean, what I tried to say in the beginning is the combination of using publicly available information with the use of intelligence officers. So they apply their tradecraft, their processes, their contextual knowledge to it. So that's really why it is called not just open source, but intelligence. I think generally it is still a stepchild. Less so in the US than in most other services, I think, because you are moving ahead, spearheading the development to some extent. Most services in Europe are not really at that stage yet, but this is definitely the trend I see, including at NATO. So we use it, of course, on the level of the individual analyst, but there's also an OSINT policy that we have, and there are specific sources and search engines that we use at NATO.
So search engines that help you find open source information related to whatever subject you're looking at. Hans, I just wrote an article in Time about child soldiers who fought for ISIS. How would you have used an article like that in your old job?
Well, in my old job for the UN, we actually relied a lot on open source intelligence, especially since the rise of ISIL, because for the longest time, at least until 2015, ISIL did everyone a favor by, in a very organized manner, so it was definitely controlled by the media department, but put out a lot of information of where people are, what was happening, what crimes were committed for propaganda purposes. So it played a very significant role at the rise of ISIL.
This is things like when they'd put out videos of beheadings and
Significant military engagements, so where you could actually, with a little bit of knowledge of Iraq and Syria, somehow figure out where this potentially would have been. But as the organization became under pressure, that material became less and less useful because they learned that we weren't the only ones looking at where this military engagement was and where they may be next. So they got smarter, but it played a very significant role. Nevertheless, I do think that there is a certain lesson that needs to be drawn, and my organization argues very much for that, is that we had massive global corporations being misused in an exaggerated manner by a global terrorist organization to recruit, to finance, to organize themselves, to communicate during attacks, including communicate during Europe, with very little from platform providers that was done against that for about 2 years. They seem to be catching on to the fact that this is a problem, but as Christchurch has demonstrated, they're catching on the Al-Qaeda ISIL side, and they just missed that right-wing people are perfectly happy to kill people as well. So there is a problem of lack of regulation in that space.
And would-be violent actors or violent actors are moving to the dark web, where is that open source anymore? If it requires a password to get onto a site, or if it's a channel that's invite only.
Well, it's open source as far as you can access it, right? So I would define Intel as something that a state sanctions for you to do something illegal in another state to obtain information, right?
And I have heard from some other intelligence officers that they've taken XYZ reporter went and interviewed, embedded with the Taliban, and for them, that article was gold because it gave them raw intelligence that they couldn't, or raw data that they couldn't get otherwise.
Yeah, but I would caution anyone who thinks that intelligence services are super eager to talk to journalists, because that is very dangerous for the journalists.
Oh no, I didn't mean to talk to the journalists. I meant read whatever's openly available and
yeah, obviously. Yeah. And as I said, I mean, OSINT is a very fancy term, but it's not a new concept. It's not something that started in the last 5 or 6 years or with the advent of ISIL. It's something that was always there. It was considered to be a less fancy part of what the organization did. But at least in our country, all source intelligence in one service was always the philosophy. And that always also included an element of open source.
And sorry, Mark and Leah both.
I'd just like to add that, again, I go back to saying that you can use intelligence as anything that's really informing an intelligence agency or informing decision making. But I think where intelligence agencies and professional government-led intelligence organizations really come into play, and what differentiates them is the ability to vet information. So when you're talking about, for example, journalists conducting an interview, that's helpful. That would be considered a single source. As a human intelligence officer, if I got information from one source, that wouldn't be a decision wouldn't be made based on one source intelligence. That would be one data point that I would then look to connect to other data points, or an analyst would look to connect other data points to essentially verify whether or not this information is true. So vetting is something that intelligence organizations do extremely well, that I think is a bit more of a challenge for open source intelligence organizations that don't quite have all of the tools that a government would have.
So an article might highlight something that, we got to go look at this, and then you go use your other tools to study it.
Absolutely. I mean, as an intelligence officer, as a human intelligence officer, in terms of targeting, if I was going to meet somebody and I wanted to know about them, I might look at a social media account. But if you look at my social media accounts, there might be times when you think I'm in Aruba, but that's actually me posting after the fact. So how good is that intelligence if it's just one source? Now, if you were to look at my Instagram page and see that I was in Aruba and then verify that with another source who saw me there, now you're onto something, right? So I think it's a matter of vetting that's very important.
Yes, I mean, I think would very much agree, first of all, with that question of having to triangulate through multiple sources. And I think this is one of the interesting advantages of open source as well as the challenge, is precisely because it actually provides a whole range of alternative ways of getting, whereas, human intelligence case officers, they have their array of existing sources and so forth. Technical intelligence have their particular exploits and so forth. OSINT can be anything from precisely social media to newspaper accounts to whatever. But what this doesn't sort of necessarily direct us towards, and I think is one of the kind of crucial points, is what is it good for and what is it not good for? I mean, I think there's an increasing sort of orthodoxy nowadays that, well, OSINT can basically tell you almost anything. And the answer is actually it can. Even if I think back to my own time when I was consuming classified materials, if I'm honest, 90 to 95% of the time, it did not change my perspective. It was often great because, my gut had told me X was the case, and now I had material, so I could think, yes, I feel more comfortable with that. But it very rarely actually revolutionized my perspective. But then there was the 5 to 10% of times when something came in through these alternative routes, which absolutely did shift me 90 degrees, 180 degrees. And in some ways, I think this is one of the difficulties we have. OSINT can do almost anything. And what we need to be much, much sharper about is what can't it do, and what, therefore, is actually the realm for everything else.
Now, something that plays into this is fake news. How does fake news make trusting what you see analytically harder? I mean, how does it complicate intelligence in general?
Well, I mean, if you look at other sources of intelligence, I mean, not only the collector and the analyst of intelligence may be affected by the fake news, but the source may be. He or she may actually believe something to be the case that is not the case. So as I said at the very beginning, it's getting more sophisticated on how misinformation is put out, and that affects everyone. But I think we getting a little bit away from the issue when we're saying what can OSINT do. I also believe that OSINT, human intelligence, SIGINT, signal intelligence, or telephone calls and anything on electronic, or image intelligence, each one of them has their role to play, and it's the vetting and the analysis part that makes it into intelligence, which is very different from a good investigative report or a journalistic report that may very well tell me what happened, but my job is not to tell the government what happened, or it is also to tell the government what happened. My job is to say, and now this is what's most likely to happen. And that is the intelligence part of it, that you always have to, the intelligence analysis part of it, you always have to look to the future. So it's of course important to understand the present, but the whole point of the exercise is not to explain what happened yesterday, but what will happen next Monday.
So crowdsourced intelligence like Bellingcat can help us understand what happened with the shoot down of the airliner over Ukraine, but it can't tell us what what Russian intelligence is planning to do next. Sorry.
Yeah, Mark asked the questions, what can OSINT not do? I think what is the hardest part is to understand what key leaders think, what their intents are, what their intentions are. I mean, it's the hardest part for almost any intelligence, but definitely for OSINT. For that, of course, human and SIGINT, some of the traditional intelligence.
So for those, human intelligence collection is someone sitting down with a contact, perhaps a source in a foreign government. They may have paid them for that intelligence, and they develop a client relationship with them. And then SIGINT is what the National Security Agency or GCHQ do. It's grabbing the electronic signals wherever they can find them, actual phone recordings tapping people's phone calls, decoding a WhatsApp message, et cetera.
Thank you for that.
Sorry.
Absolutely, it's all right. So listening to real conversations, for instance. So this is a limitation of OSINT, but really the answer is, as all of you have been saying, not to just have one data point, but to have as many different types of as possible from different forms of intelligence and do all sorts of intelligence.
And the question of what can OSINT do for us, I think it's really applicable to the work that I'm doing at the Global Engagement Center. So for those of you who don't know, the Global Engagement Center directs, leads, synchronizes, and coordinates efforts of the U.S. government to counter propaganda and disinformation from state and non-state actors. We work with international partners, we work with NGOs, the private sector, basically across the board. The international community of countering propaganda and disinformation is basically who we seek to be energizing that network with and helping to counter propaganda and disinformation. So a good example of how OSINT is very helpful for us is that if we were to detect a disinformation campaign in one of our partner countries, well, we would want to inform them of that so that they could do their own work to counter that disinformation. But they would want to see evidence. So if we were to use our traditional intelligence sources, if we were to use SIGINT, it would take a long time to try to declassify that, if we even could declassify it, to then share with our partner countries. With OSINT, much of it's going to be, for the most part, it's going to be unclassified. So we can use this, commercial off-the-shelf technology, or companies or NGOs that have discovered a disinformation campaign, and then share that with partner nations while they still have the time to act on it and then to counter propaganda or disinformation.
But then the problem is that because it's open, adversaries will learn from it. Other than clandestine intelligence, which is only kept in government circles. So there are examples like tracking movements of soldiers by their social media communications with their families or so. And now what we see is that the Russian armed forces ban the use of mobile phones.
But of course, what they couldn't ban was the from my understanding, there are a lot of car accidents in Russia, and so because of that, people have cameras in their dashboards that are running all the time to capture what actually happened. And because of that, there are a lot of pictures that got posted to the web of tanks going into Crimea from Russia, and Russia couldn't do anything about that. Another aspect of this, though, is the Skripal attack, the attack on the former Russia spy in Britain. I, as a reporter trying to track that down, was basically stuck between the U.S. and the U.K. telling us, here's what we believe happened, and we'd ask for proof, and they would say, well, you just got it. Can't show you. The same thing when we were reporting on moves with Iran and what happened with an alleged Iranian attack through a proxy on a tanker in the Gulf. Show us, sorry, we can't. And for us, it means, and then back to the Skripal example, then Russian officials and Russian media put out 9 or 10 different versions of what actually likely happened. And for the reporter then, it's almost like, is it a test of patriotism? Is it a test of who is telling me the thing I can believe? So that's my frustration when you all in the intel world say take it on faith, and I can't find something in the open source world to back it up.
I think it's really important to work together and to come up with ways that you can share information as best as possible. But I think what I would say on that is that you as a journalist and me as a former journalist, we are sources of information for adversaries, for countries that would do us harm. And so that's why from the intelligence community, we have to be so careful with what we share, because as you were saying, you can inform those who would do harm through journalism or through OSINT.
But then that leaves you open to the situation where the public might believe one of those 9 or 10 different alternative versions because it cleaves with their view of the world.
And that is one of the trickiest parts of the work that I do at the Global Engagement Center. And that's why we believe that building resiliency in populations is so key. And what I mean when I say building resiliency is basically developing sort of a in the back of your head thought process that's skeptical when you look at information. When we go online, we should all be thinking, what's the source of this information and can I trust it? And it kind of goes back to journalism as well. When I first got into journalism in 2009, the big thing was citizen journalists. Everyone's a journalist now because everyone has a phone. And this was actually kind of scary to people who were professional journalists, because are we going to lose our careers to anybody who has an iPhone? But I think what we all quickly learned is how well vetted is that person, how well vetted is that source, and can you trust them as a reporter, or might they be doing something funny online and just want to trick you with a story that's not even true? So I think we have to apply that across the board now and be skeptical as we look at information, and make sure that we're taking a look at sources and developing sources that we trust.
And by the way, I'm going to be switching to questions shortly, and we don't have the Slido app, so you're going to have to raise hands the old-fashioned way. But Mark, you had something.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when one looks at the Skripal case, I mean, it was problematic. And I think in both the case of the UK and US governments, I personally might think they were a little bit too conservative. Because what we've got to realize, and this sort of fits into the whole kind of disruptive ethos of this whole conference, is actually the sense to which we are currently going through a period of a generalized legitimacy crisis. And so many of the other issues is because, you know, there are populations who have come to regard with skepticism what sort of standard, you know, that very concept of that term, mainstream media, which I can't stand, but it somehow implies that, well, it's their media, it's kind of outside. They don't believe they're politicians and so forth, and therefore they are precisely vulnerable to disinformation and such like. But I would actually want to bring out the Dutch response to the OPCW hack, which for me was an absolute masterclass in how you do handle these cases. When they caught Russian spies.
I was going to say, for the audience, can you explain the hack?
I mean, they caught some Russian GRU officers who were technical intelligence people who are, you know, in the car park of the neighboring hotel, trying to break into the systems of the OPCW, the anti-chemical weapons watchdog, precisely to see what the OPCW had. And I mean, the Dutch, when they did release it, they were incredibly open. They released a lot of information. They treated the audience as adults. They used a certain amount of humor, which is always a good weapon to use. But the main thing is they did not just simply assume. They did not just simply say, here are some oldish men in suits, and they will tell you how it really was. They will realize that doesn't work anymore. And they instead have to say, you may be skeptical. You may have already heard 50 different sort of theories about what goes on. We're going to show you actually how it really was. And that is effective. And I think this is the other, I think, value of open source, is because absolutely everyone gets to try to define it. But in fact, if we genuinely do have truth on our side, however naive it may be we say that, we already have a very powerful force multiplier for how we use open source also as a means of influencing opinion.
I'm going to throw the wrench in there, though, with deep fakes coming online, the ability to alter videos so that you can't tell that it was anything but what it's being presented as.
No, but all that means is precisely, therefore, we need to be all the more assiduous. It won't just simply be saying, well, here is, for example, as in Skripal, here are footage from the airport of our two suspected wannabe assassins coming in. You'll have to treat the public like analysts who themselves will be looking to triangulate, who themselves will be saying, well, one source we don't trust. So you're saying, fine, here are 10 sources.
Did they reveal through that? It sounds like you were familiar with what the Dutch did with this. Did they reveal anything ultimately that damaged their sources methods collection?
I don't think so. I also agree, and I wanted to bring up the same example because it's the finest I know, incredibly well researched, actually Dutch and British collaboration, and it was full of details and evidence. I think they made very clear that they didn't reveal any information that would damage their tradecraft. That was the the bulk of the work is to distinguish those two, but it was the most convincing example to the general public that I know. And for instance, in Germany, I've heard a lot of skepticism when I talk to the public about is hybrid warfare, does that really exist, and so on. And this example was the one that got so much traction.
Now, you're in a position at NATO where you're taking intelligence streams from a number of different nations, and I know that there are always issues with intelligence sharing. You know, the Americans don't want to share with X country because they're too friendly with Moscow, et cetera. What about this makes your job harder? And is open source intelligence one of the few things that you have no problem sharing?
Well, it's a continuous challenge for us. Of course, how much does a nation want to share at 29 nations? There's always there's a risk and there's a gain, and in every instance, the donating nation makes a cost-benefit analysis, if you like. Taking the example of Skripal, the Brits came to us at a very early stage and shared more than they shared with the public because the ultimately intelligence sharing has a purpose. It's not just for the sake of sharing or fulfilling a duty, but you want to drive a decision and have provoke a consequence at NATO. And in this case, it was very clear that the consequence would be or could be to expel intelligence professionals under the guise of diplomats. And in fact, we were able within a few days to expel about 150 from NATO countries. So that was a direct consequence of this.
Hans, when you were in your UN position, how much difficulty did you have getting access to member nations' intelligence that you needed for your job?
Surprisingly, much less than we thought we had. I mean, first of all, this team that I was leading doesn't exist only since yesterday. It has a track record of the last 15 years of being a trusted partner with many nations. Obviously, also, the UN Security Council level, when it's about building a global sanctions regime, is a fairly strategic level. So you never really have to ask for extremely detailed operational information, except on individuals that are already publicly sanctioned by the Security Council, i.e. unlikely to be a target of a targeted intelligence operation by one member state because the name's already on the loudest, most public sanctions list that there is on the globe. So it worked quite well, but it is, and I just wanted to do one little footnote on how easy it is with OSINT to share. Intelligence sharing is not a question necessarily of what source the intelligence had before you got into your system. That doesn't really make it much easier or harder to get it out of your system. It is a question of trust between two partners. If you have a high level of trust, you can share much more. If you have a low level of trust, you will share next to nothing. And that would include open source intelligence, because in an analysis, it will not just be open source intelligence. It will have also included other intelligence. So just because it comes from the internet or a newspaper into the process, the outgoing product is not exactly much easier to share if it's 90% OSINT, if you do not trust the other service on the other side.
And I think sometimes, just to add to that, it's not just a matter of how well you trust each other as countries. It's also how well you trust the information infrastructure that a partner country is using, because sometimes you might very much trust a country, but if they're using an information infrastructure that's not trustworthy or that's easy penetratable, then you're going to be less likely to share information.
You mean like perhaps if they have some Russian or Chinese software or hardware as part of their intrinsic as part of their system? Feel free to talk about Huawei if you like.
Your words. Yeah. Well, you're referring to the issues of infrastructure and information sharing, and I think that anytime that you want to share with anyone, and this applies just across the board, you want to know if you're going to trust them with a secret, whether or not you can trust that person, but also whether or not you can trust where they might store that secret, or how that might be transmitted. So that is always going to come into play beyond just the trust of the relationships. But OSINT, I think, is extremely useful because, going back to what I've said before, it's not necessarily the information you have today that's so sensitive. It's sensitive information that you're sharing if it's intelligence, but it's the sources and the methodology by which you collected it. Because if that information is compromised, it makes it much more difficult to do the work in the future and makes you much more vulnerable to attacks by the adversary.
One of the things that has made the journalism job harder, and I don't know if at your time at Fox, if you experienced this as well, the proliferation of social media means when someone goes out there with a report, a citizen journalist report, or a picture of an explosion in X location, and we check the geolocation, and it does look like it's, in the center of Baghdad, and it does look like it's a massive explosion outside the U.S. Embassy or something like that. There is the pressure on us to confirm. And also the pressure to well, you've got the picture, so if you just get one source, that's enough. Whereas usually your editor would want 2 or 3 sources before you'd go out on air. How does that change in the intel world? Is there a similar effect?
Well, I think it comes back to, in the intel world, you always want to be able to vet your sources, and you want to be able to have multiple sources to make a decision with before you assess it to be actually true information. I certainly, had the experience that you did, where in news, the ratings increase if you are the first one to come to air with some sort of a major situation that's happened. But we've seen situations in the past where major news organizations have reported something that might have been actually a military exercise, but thought it was a major incident happening in Washington, and they wanted to be the first to report, and made the mistake by going to air saying it was an incident when actually it was just something that was an exercise, whereas other news organizations were more careful to vet the information. I think that's always true in terms of information, and it's certainly true in terms of intelligence.
So I would say, in principle, it's not that different in intelligence. Also, the more confirmations from other sources you have, the better your outcome is, the better you can inform decision makers. But of course, there's a tension. If you see something very important on a single source, you cannot always wait for days or weeks because that politicians make decisions at an early stage, and then you also have this effect of hybrid blurring. And that we've seen that many times with Russia and probably other
Hybrid
nations.
blurring.
So if the example of Skripal was mentioned, and there were almost 10 narratives that Russia put out that confused Western audiences. I know many such examples. So it is actually important to come out with a clear decision or statement at an early stage. But then you don't really want to do that with only a single source. So you have that tension in much the same way that you have it as a journalist.
Internally, you can put high, medium, and low confidence, but you can only go to the public with high confidence.
Yeah, but also, it has an effect in a different way, is that intelligence gathering and analysis is not a service in itself. It serves decision making. And so you do get much more pressure from decision makers. Even in my position at the UN, let alone in the government, who want quicker information and analysis of what this means and what goes on. And so you are a little bit more driven because your decision makers that you work for have already or are in the process of forming an opinion, and that puts more time pressure on. You cannot say, I come back to you in 2 weeks when I have verified this with 5 different sources.
I have to say, one situation where I was involved as a reporter, I was at the AP when the attack happened on the U.S. Outpost in Benghazi. And of course, I talked to the CIA that day as the news was breaking, and from the beginning, we were being told we were allowed to say, U.S. intelligence officials or CIA officials believe that there was some sort of riot at the scene. And separately from that, so that was in my report. The other thing that came from the AP person who was on the ground, she interviewed both the writer and then the fixer who was on the scene, interviewed some Libyans who had seen on social media come to the U.S. Consulate. There's going to be a demonstration against this anti-Islamic film. And so some people came. They told the AP reporter and fixer, they came with signs to protest and also saw guys with guns and RPGs, et cetera, and said, whoa, this is not what we signed up for. So I later talked to both the House Intelligence Committee and other U.S. intelligence officers who said, look, when we were giving our assessment to top Obama administration officials, we were relying on some of your reports. And I later talked to a group of U.S. military officers who'd also tracked that stuff happening on social media, that the militants seemed to be trying to create an event that would draw a crowd that they could hide in. So I kind of felt responsible later in that the Obama administration just first went out and made some comments saying that this all started as a demonstration, and then were accused of covering things up. So I don't know what your take was on that at the time, or if you were in active duty somewhere in the Navy.
I was actually a reporter for NBC News in San Diego at the time. But I go back to, I guess, really thinking in terms of, you hear about the fog of war, and being a reporter, there's also the fog of breaking news, where in my experience as a journalist, you have to be extremely careful because the facts are changing as time goes on, and we've seen this again and again. Pretty much every major breaking news situation, some of the early reporting is oftentimes not true. And it's because people are trying to get information out as quickly as possible. They're reporting what they see on the ground and what they're hearing from sources, and then that picture is built over time.
But they're seeing straws.
Exactly. They're seeing points, data points, right? Sources on the ground, but somebody might see something and believe it to be one thing when from a different perspective it's completely different. So I think that's sort of a natural thing that happens in any sort of a breaking news situation, is that there is somewhat of a fog initially that eventually a picture is built over time.
It's one of the things I was told about Benghazi was that the contractor who wrote the book 13 Hours was a U.S. congressman declassified this, and I reported it at the AP, and the report went nowhere, which was really frustrating because the CIA allowed him to say this to me, that when U.S. forces had pulled out after the NATO operation in Libya, a classified memo went out at the highest levels, but only to CIA staffers. So the gentleman, the CIA staffer, security officer in charge of security in Benghazi at the CIA base, which was of course separate from the U.S. diplomatic base, knew that if there was an attack, there would be no rescue. But the contractors weren't read in on that. So they were operating on two different sets of information, and those things have played out in the media as has become a huge political battle that arguably damaged Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. And I know it certainly hurt the political standing of former House Intelligence Chairman Mike Rogers, who was a Republican, put out the report with all of this in it publicly, and then got hammered for it. Question right here. And could you identify yourself? And do we have any microphones? Question right here. And to the audience, please always make sure there's a question in your question.
Thank you very much. Mario Nicolini, Slovak Value for Money Unit in Ministry of Finance this time. Thank you very much for this exposition of the current trends in this very important area, which makes me think of other functions of government which do a lot of the same things that the intelligence community does, meaning dealing with a lot of information, collating, analyzing, in order to then shaping or helping make a good policy decision. Are we aware in any of these nations that you work for or with of maybe attempts to sort of share or demand the know-how of intelligence to support other functions that do particularly open source and maybe also the shady, whatever we can access intelligence functions that you have, big data, analysis. Is there anything, or is the intelligence community pretty much still what it used to be and what it is?
Mark.
I mean, first of all, it's worth mentioning it's a two-way flow. It's not just about what other agencies can learn from how intelligence agencies handle information. It's also increasingly actually intelligence agencies realizing that instead of assuming that they are the repositories of all wisdom, they can actually look out and see how a whole variety of other institutions sort of gather it. But particularly, I mean, I would, of course, mention the British model, which is naturally the finest in all the world. But interestingly, because in Britain, ultimately, it is the Cabinet Office, which is the sort of primary connection point between the activities of the agencies and policy making through the institution of the Joint Intelligence Committee and so forth. I won't go into the minutiae. But the point is the Cabinet Office also has a much, much wider remit as being the primary agency that supports the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And although clearly the secure bit of the Cabinet Office is physically and institutionally fairly separate, you do have exactly flow across. And interestingly, I have spoken to people who I know who work in the Cabinet Office, who talk about, who are now no longer working in any spooky capacity. But nonetheless, it's quite fascinating how many of the same sort of terms about the intelligence cycle and so forth has crept into how they look at precisely. Because nowadays, after all, governments are information handling machines. And so what can be learned from the intelligence side to wider forms of government? But I think that's that's a particular situation because you have the same human material being involved in a whole variety of different Cabinet Office activities. I'm not sure how broad it is.
Question right there.
Yeah, Yicheng like Prospect Foundation, Taiwan. So the question sort of follows what the earlier question is, but the issue is that how about the artificial intelligence and data analytics really transform the way that we process usually in the past about the open source information and open source intelligence?
Good point.
Well, thanks for making that point. I think it increasingly makes a role, but I think something is misunderstood there. So artificial intelligence is fantastic in economic and weather predictions, but that if you wanted to automate your predictions of how a politician, a government, a regime, a terror organization wants to act in the future, you would have, for artificial intelligence to be super effective, to assume that they are by and large or mainly rational actors, which in many often cases they are not. So while weather predictions with artificial intelligence still are pretty, touch and go at sometimes, and we had many times the last year massive snowstorms in New York that never materialized, predicting the behavior of a partial rational actor such as another government or a regime and a massively irrational actor like a terrorist organization, I don't think artificial intelligence is going to be making this qualitatively much better than it is right now, because it still involves a art form where you put a puzzle together with the minimum amount of puzzle pieces and then you try to describe the picture that may or may not be emerging.
So you think AI can look back, but it's not so good at looking forward?
Not as far as I can see.
Yes, I agree with that. I think AI will rise in importance. Of course, we're going to be dealing with increasingly vast volumes of data. So of course we will need that in machine learning, but I agree with you that there will always have to be an element of human analysis and interpretation, and also putting everything into context in an all source intelligence form. So it's not the 100% answer to everything. The relative weight will grow, but you have to see it in a broader context.
Does AI help you, Leah, in your job spot fake news, trends, a state actor trying to put a message out there?
AI is extremely important in countering propaganda and disinformation, because when you look at how much information is out there right now, it's finding the signal in the noise. So SIGINT, they're listening to everything, but they want to find what actually matters from that. AI can do a lot of scooping up all that data that's out there and then doing some analytics. But what's very important is continuing to inform the algorithm. So you train the algorithm, but you have to have that human in the loop that can then retrain it or redevelop it or adjust course as you go along. And what we've really found where AI is particularly useful is when we can gather information in terms of trends, what target audiences are being targeted by adversaries for disinformation campaigns, how they're actually targeting them, and then also how influential they're actually being, because we're not going to put resources onto a disinformation campaign if it's not influencing anybody in the first place. But what is really key is having human analysts who are able to take that information and then help you understand what it actually means. So those of us who operationalize countering propaganda and disinformation need that informed opinion from human analysts who have cultural expertise, who have language expertise, who understand the situation on the ground, and that's always going to be key. I do think AI can be helpful in some predictive measures. I mean, you look at how much advertisers can be focused on people based on what they're clicking on when they're online, right? So it can be somewhat predictive, but ultimately that human in the loop is going to be extremely important.
Now, I'm going to take advantage of having you here. I mean, when your office was first set up, some journalists may have derisively said it was tweeting at terrorists. You just talked about using AI and this information to analyze how people are basically getting messaged, how propaganda is delivered to them, and then what? How do you counter it? Because the U.S. isn't supposed to spread propaganda to its own people, but propaganda is getting spread at them.
And let me be very clear, we don't. The truth is on our side. So in fact, in our legislation that established the Global Engagement Center, it tells us that we should be using fact-based narratives. And when we talk about open source information, a lot of the groups that are out there doing OSINT are focused on finding the truth and discovering what is actually truthful. So it's very important to know. You mentioned the tweeting at terrorists, and for those of you who don't know, what is now called the GEC, the organization that was first stood up that had a different name, was initially set up because terrorists were using the internet to radicalize people online. And the question was, we've got to do something about this. We can't just leave this space in internet chat rooms uncontested. So we have had iterations of how we go about countering propaganda from terrorist organizations and countering disinformation, and that has evolved over time. So what we've learned is that just the point-to-point game of whack-a-mole is not nearly as effective as building resiliency in populations. So like I was saying before, getting people to think twice when they read something online, when they see a picture online, getting them to think twice, is this real? If I haven't heard about this, maybe there's a reason, maybe it's something that's not even true. So we can do that by training journalists to do investigative journalism, to spot disinformation. We can do that by funding organizations that get out there and have more resources than we do to spot disinformation. We can do it by funding organizations that develop algorithms and that develop technology that can spot disinformation. For example, organizations that can develop essentially a bot where if someone finds an article online and they want to know if it's true, they can send it to that bot and it will basically assess based on an algorithm the likelihood that it's actually true. And it can also run it against different IP addresses that are typically known for spreading disinformation. So there's a number of different ways that we counter propaganda and disinformation, but a big part of that is building resiliency in populations.
I was just educated by the Forbes representative at the conference about the Eurobarometer. Is anyone familiar with it? So this is an EU tool of getting a vetted and verified way to reach out and poll the opinions of European citizens. And what I'm surprised by is that governments don't create more ways other than voting every couple of years to gauge people's opinions, because that becomes an important part of open source information. You know, if there's a trend on Twitter that makes it look like everybody hates, I don't know, Lima beans, but you can poll them and figure out, oh, actually, no, people don't hate Lima beans. That's disinformation according to this verified poll that we all trust. I kind of like a Bitcoin for public opinion.
I'm a bit taken aback. Government, at least my government, polls people all the time on just about anything you can imagine. So I wouldn't say that governments don't poll, and I'm quite sure the American government may hesitate to poll once in a while. So I think polling is going on the whole time. The question really is whether this amount of misinformation and deepfakes and manipulation that's going on via the internet, whether you can actually get your polling sample in a way that it's now actually representative of what the population actually feels. I think that's the problem with polling right now, that your sample collection, who do you poll to get the actual opinion, is getting far more complex. And I think all the election polling in 2016 for Brexit and for the American presidential elections were an absolute shining example how difficult it is and how wrong you can get. And then a year later with the British election, again, the polls were pretty off by a surprisingly large margin. So the sampling of your polling is getting more difficult.
Leah.
I think also, you know, polling is one thing, but it's kind of like how many likes something gets online compared to what action somebody actually takes. So it's a big difference between what somebody might say when they're polled versus what action they take by actually going to vote, and then, you know, who they actually vote for when they do. You use the example of Lima beans. Whether somebody likes Lima beans or not is different from whether they actually go buy them at the store. And so that's what we have to really look at, is the actions.
True, and I hope I haven't offended any Lima bean fans in the audience. We have
just one sentence. Polling is very commonplace in many European countries, and the key thing is who conducts the polling, how much trust there is in this organization. Eurobarometer is one example. There are many others.
Got it. So we have just time. We have like 2 minutes left. So can we rocket through 2 questions really fast? Here.
First, Captain John Jacobs, not here on military anything, just wearing a uniform because I can. My previous posting was public affairs, so people ask, like, what do you do? I said, right, the enemy does propaganda, we do engagement, just as a joke. But we did see a convergence between, say, what the security officer said that we couldn't show and talk about, and we, of course, wanted to talk about. 2 extremes, now becoming a horseshoe. How do you see that nexus? What role does open source information play in that? What role does a power and Stratcom and InfoOps have in intelligence gathering?
Let's make that the last one, and then, sorry, one more.
Agne, Deloitte, cybersecurity. I just want to ask, because you talked about intelligence sharing and working together among states, mostly interested in how do you, it seems like sometimes we are locked in intelligence paradox, and intelligence sharing a paradox. So how do you overcome that paradox? How do you utilize resources and better share with states that act upon that, preventing big disasters? Thanks.
Okay, and so everybody has 30 seconds each to finish. Who wants to go first? Leah.
Well, I'll say you look great in your uniform, so I would wear mine too if I could, because you look fabulous. But to answer your question about public affairs and the sharing of information versus not sharing of information, I think a lot of times it comes down to what I was saying before about what the source is, and does sharing the information ultimately compromise the future use of the source and the methodology of which that information was obtained. So I think when you look at open source intelligence, it opens a lot of doors, because if it's unclassified information, or if it's openly, the methodology is openly used, then it opens a lot of doors in terms of what you can share.
Yeah, so security is absolutely key for sharing intelligence. in my 2.5 years in this position, I've learned that very well, and we're putting enormous efforts into the technical basis of improving security for intelligence sharing. We look at our systems, we do cyber hygiene, we define exactly who the end users are, and all of that is really the basis to convince nation services to share valuable intelligence with us.
Last two thoughts?
Yeah, and just as a painful reminder, understanding what the other side is actually saying is really difficult. You have to have a common language. I seem to remember there was something about trucks and laboratories in just before a war started in 2003 that may or may not have come from our service. And there was simply not enough understanding that this was a crazy person. And that just got lost in the sharing. So it's not just the question, do you trust the other side? There was no trust issues. It's not a question whether you do not trust their information storage. There was no concern about that. They simply did not understand what was said to them, and that led to fairly consequential outcomes that were not good for either side.
And of course, you can go the opposite
the common
direction.
language is the other hurdle of intelligence sharing, unless you're talking about the very simple data, here's the name, here's the birth date. When it comes to complex issues, it's really important to understand what moderate confidence means, because it may mean something totally different for the other side than it does for your side.
And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into the Iraq War and how everyone trusted one source too much because they trusted each other. Our last thought.
The best opinion polls back in the Soviet days were carried out by the KGB. Though obviously they did not say they were the KGB when they were asking people questions. And in fact, they were really surprisingly good at understanding the attitudes of the Soviet population. However, I once had a conversation with a veteran of those times who said one of the big problems, though, was actually getting people in the Central Committee of the Communist Party to actually believe our surveys. So they said, well, once we managed to crack into, I think it might have been an RFE-RL, but anyway, an American, a Western-based opinion survey of emigres, which they could then use to bulk up their own surveys. And at that point, suddenly the Communist Party thought, oh, well, maybe we'll believe this because the Americans are proving it. One of the problems is exactly open source can provide you with vast amounts of information, but actually getting it into policy making often is the challenge, because people think that if it's not bought hard, then it can't necessarily be trusted.
And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming to this open source intelligence panel. And if you all could wait just a moment as the panelists leave the stage, if you want to chat with them, they'll be right outside. We're going to go straight into the cyber defense panel. So if you guys could head out the door before you get mired. Thank you very much.